Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's WINS webinar. My name is Dawn Reinhardt-Wood, and I'm faculty at Rutgers University School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling. And I'm joined by my colleague, Emily Bands, also from the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling, and she will be leading this webinar today, in which we'll be discussing connecting thoughts to behaviors in applying cognitive behavioral techniques in supportive housing. So a little housekeeping, just want to go over some of the audio and video. Your audio and video are muted. You can use computer audio or use the call-in number to access the audio to today's webinar. To ask or respond to questions, use the chat. You may type in questions or comments in the little chat box. Make sure that you've changed the to in who your chat messages will go to everyone so that everyone can see it. If it's on only hosts and panelists, only Emily and I will see it, but we will see it eventually. It's just easier if it's in the chat so that everybody can see the questions and comments, as people may have similar questions. And as for accessibility, subtitles are available. To see subtitles, you can click on show captions. And today we want to remind you that the webinar is being recorded. The presentation and recording will be made available by Washington HCA following the conclusion of this webinar. And as such, today's webinar is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is an interactive training, so we encourage you to ask questions and participate throughout the session. The slides, as well as a link to the recording of the webinar, will be sent by email again after the presentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Emily. I'll be here to check the chat. If anybody has questions or comments, I'll be manning the chat.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for the introduction. So today we are going to very much be focusing on cognitive behavioral therapy and looking at sort of some of the theoretical components of cognitive behavioral therapy, just to give people that background and that understanding, because I do think it's helpful and needed in trying to then apply some of this information to specific techniques that you can teach to the individuals that you're working with, right? So we're going to focus on recognizing that theory behind CBT, really talk about describing some of the major concepts of CBT, and then go into specific techniques that are going to be applicable to providing services and CBT related services within supportive housing. And I appreciate everybody in the chat saying hello, shouting out from where you are. I always love seeing where folks are from in our webinars, because it's cool to see where everybody's at. I know that there's very big differences between the East and Central and Western Washington, so thank you guys for letting us know. So before I get into some of the more denser parts of the webinar today, I did just want to get into and give a little bit of a shout out to the two main theorists behind cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's going to be Aaron Beck and it's going to be Albert Ellis. And Aaron Beck is really the person who has developed what we now know as modern CBT. Aaron Beck has his own institute, the Beck Institute, which is currently run by his daughter, Dr. Judith Beck, and that's based in the Philadelphia area. And then we have Albert Ellis, who is the father of rational emotive behavioral therapy. And again, Albert Ellis has his own institute as well. I think the Ellis Institute is run out of New York City. And you can do a quick Google search of either the Beck Institute or the Albert Ellis Institute, and you'll be able to find their websites. They have a lot of really great information on the websites that could, be helpful for you if you are interested in learning a little bit more about CBT beyond what we're going to talk about today, as well as rational emotive behavioral therapy, or REBT. But our webinar today is really going to focus more on CBT. It's important, though, to kind of shout out Albert Ellis though, because some of the theories that have influenced cognitive behavioral therapy are things that Albert Ellis actually came up with as well. So when we think of the four main theories that have really influenced cognitive behavioral therapy, we're looking at classical conditioning, operant conditioning, social learning theory, and then cognitive appraisal theory. And cognitive appraisal theory is where Albert Ellis comes in. So who here is, let me just kind of gauge the audience here. So is everybody kind of familiar with some of these theories? Is there I know that a lot of this is kind of talked about in like level 101 psychology courses, but before I get into a lot of detail, I do just want to gauge the audience and see what people's thoughts are. Is this information theories that you guys are maybe familiar with, or you're hearing it and you're like, oh, maybe I know this information?
We're seeing some sums, we're seeing very familiar, except the cognitive
Okay.
appraisal theory, yeah, generally.
Generally, yes. All right, cool. So then I'm just going to give a very brief overview, just in case anybody isn't familiar, get everybody on the same page. So when we're thinking of classical conditioning, we're thinking about changing or modifying behavior through linking the behavior to an environmental stimulus and then to another environmental stimulus. So the best example I could give you is Pavlov and his dogs, right? So he conditioned dogs to salivate, which was the behavior, by pairing the behavior with food and a bell, right? So every time he would ring the bell and show the dog food, the dog would begin to salivate. Okay, so that is kind of how that idea of classical conditioning works. When we're thinking about operant conditioning, we're going to B.F. Skinner. And when we're thinking of operant conditioning, we're talking about modifying the behavior through manipulation of precursors to a behavior and behavior consequence. So this is really focusing on a lot of positive and negative reinforcement. And the example that I like to use is a personal example with my dogs to kind of explain this. So I have unfortunately unintentionally reinforced my dogs to want a treat every time I go to the treat bag. That's not how it started. What I attempted to do was train them to do different commands like sit or give paw. So I would ask them to sit, give them the ask them to sit, give them the treat, ask them to give paw, give them a treat. But what has eventually happened is that once they see the treat, now they'll just do the command. Or once they hear the bag, they'll run inside our kitchen and they'll just sit down and do the command without me even asking, right? And that's positive reinforcement because they know that this good thing is coming when they do this, once they do the thing that I'm asking them to do, or at this point, the thing I'm not even asking them to do anymore. And then when we're looking at social learning theory, that is Alfred Bandura, and that is learning through observation. So it's really focusing on when someone is learning indirectly. It's also focusing on reciprocal interactions with others. So that's a person maybe having beliefs and thoughts about life based on their personal experiences or observations, which has then influenced their interactions with others as well as their behavior. We talk a lot about social learning theory related to like skills training. When we talk about modeling and modeling behavior, that concept is very much rooted and based in social learning theory. And then when we're thinking about cognitive appraisal from Albert Ellis, that's really talking about how our perceptions of our lives, the world, etc., are impacting our beliefs. So it's more of a it's more of a way to kind of view the world and understand that how we're perceiving the world and how our perception is of the world, of our lives, of the people within our lives, how that is then impacting how we're thinking and believing about the world. So CBT is, very simply put, really just focusing on working with individuals through the lens of their behavior and their thoughts, and how there's this connection and influence between people's thoughts and behaviors. But you might recognize, as we're talking about the cognitive model and really talking about some of the main concepts within CBT, you might recognize that there are some of these underpinnings of information from classical conditioning, operant conditioning, cognitive appraisal theory, and then social learning theory. When Dr. Aaron Beck was coming up with this theory, he really pulled from some of these other earlier theories on behavior and cognition. So before I move into the cognitive model, I know I just kind of gave you some a little bit more dense information. Does anybody have any questions about anything I just talked about? And if not, that's totally okay. I just wanted to put it out there. Yeah. All right, cool. We'll keep it moving. So the cognitive model really focuses on this idea of dysfunctional thoughts and the difference between the impact of dysfunctional thoughts versus realistic thoughts. Okay. So when somebody is experiencing dysfunctional thoughts, the idea is that these dysfunctional thoughts are going to influence our mood, and they're going to influence our behavior, which is then going to contribute to somebody experiencing poor mental health or mental health symptoms, right? Those symptoms are going to develop and they're going to increase. However, when somebody focuses more on developing realistic thoughts, either intentionally or unintentionally, right? When individuals have the ability to assess and really recognize their thoughts to support developing more realistic thoughts, the idea is that that's going to cause symptoms to then decrease, right? So when we're looking at the cognitive model, it's focusing on this, again, this connection between dysfunctional thoughts causing or contributing to symptoms increasing, and more realistic thoughts contributing to symptoms decreasing. And a large part of the cognitive model is the cognitive triangle. Has anybody here heard about the cognitive triangle before? Is this something that people are familiar with? All right, awesome. I'm getting some yeses. So very simply put, when we're looking at the cognitive triangle, we're looking at this idea that a situation is occurring. And when the situation occurs, it's contributing to someone using thoughts, whether that be positive thoughts or more realistic thoughts, or the person is experiencing unrealistic thoughts. And those thoughts are going to drive someone's behavior and drive their feelings. And the example that I like to give, and I've had this conversation with consumers who I've worked with in the past when I'm kind of explaining CBT to them and kind of explaining some of the techniques that I've taught to individuals to help them with learn how to think more realistically. The example I like to give people, and feel free to use this in the future, is you're walking down the street and you see a friend. And you call out to the friend and you say, "Hey, how are you? Hi, it's me, it's Emily. Hey, Dawn." Calling to Dawn down the street. "Hey, Dawn, what's going on?" But Dawn just keeps walking. Dawn doesn't turn around. She doesn't acknowledge me at all. So my initial thought is, Dawn must be mad at me. Or Dawn must be annoyed with me. And then I start to feel upset and I start to feel frustrated because I'm thinking to myself, well, why is Dawn upset with me? Why would Dawn be mad at me? That was really rude. Why wouldn't Dawn want to, acknowledge me and turn around and say hi? So then what I do is I see on the ground that there's a rock and I pick the rock up and I throw it at Dawn's head. And Dawn turns around, shocked and confused because I just threw a rock at her head, and takes her earbuds out of her
That wasn't
ears.
very nice, Emily. That time you threw a rock at my.
I know, it's not. And I use this example to be funny. I'm trying to use more of a very irrational example that maybe hopefully isn't happening. Feel free to use this example if it makes sense. If it doesn't, that's okay. Typically, I get laughs from people when I do use this example because obviously it's pretty unrealistic. But Dawn takes the earbuds out of her ears, and now I say, "Oops, I'm in a lot of trouble because I just threw a rock at Dawn's head." And now if she wasn't mad at me before because she didn't hear me, but now she's going to be mad at me now. Right. And I think that's an interesting way to just kind of explain how situations can evoke these types of thoughts. And that's going to then contribute to the behavior that we participate in, as well as our feelings. And I think it can be very helpful for people to really understand that connection, especially in leading up to teaching them some of these techniques. So what are some of your thoughts? Have you all explained the cognitive triangle to any of the individuals that you're working with? What do you guys think of the example? Do you think it might be helpful, might not be helpful? What are some of your thoughts? All right, awesome. So Whisper, you said that you've explained this within client groups, which I think is awesome. And I don't know if other people have experienced this as well, but I in my experience, having an example of how this is demonstrated has been helpful to some of the individuals I've worked with. Because I feel like when I've tried to explain to them the cognitive triangle and kind of explaining how, you know, a situation can influence our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings, sometimes people are like, yeah, I get that. But having an example that can be like a good go-to to really explain this is something that I found to be very helpful for people. I'm not sure if any of you have experienced similar things. Yeah, absolutely, Diana. I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Examples are always more practical than theory. Um, And Dawn, I want to call out your comment. Dawn said, I've taught these concepts to staff in state psych hospitals and even just managing how they feel, their coworkers and supervisors interact with them. It can be a hostile work environment, and folks seem to be conditioned to think automatically in the negative vein. Yeah, and I think the environment can really play a role in that. You know, if you're in an environment where there's a lot of tension. I could see why people might go to the more unrealistic thing versus maybe the person isn't intentionally trying to ignore them or the person isn't intentionally trying to hurt their feelings. All right,
Yeah,
awesome. Thank
Emily,
you.
I just wanted to like expand on that. It's usually when when the staff in the hospital, nursing staff or nursing aides, the human service technicians talk about this, it's usually boils down to two people not having a lot of time and information, right? So like a handoff is really quick and short, and the person receiving the handoff feels as if the other individual addressed them in a negative way, or they simply don't like them, right? And a lot of it has to do with what you said, that high demand, high stress environment, and things are being done quickly and maybe not as thoroughly as they could be, right? Almost like how when people communicate through text, it could be misinterpreted, right? So
yeah, there's not a there sometimes we as human beings, we need context, right? We need a little bit more information. So that body language, that smile, right? Or that little wave, or the body, if your body language is in a way that's more open, right? That's going to tell the person who you're conversating with that maybe you're in a good space and you're in a good mood. Whereas if you're walking around like this, or you're not making eye contact, or you're using a very short tone of voice, that can also impact things, right? And if we go back to the situation that I kind of mentioned, right? If when I had called out to Dawn, hypothetically, right, in the situation, if Dawn had turned around and waved, that probably would have ended it right there, right? It wasn't even a need for further conversation, right? But it was the fact that nothing occurred. That's when my thoughts in the situation started kind of spiraling and started overthinking and ruminating and really thinking that something negative was happening. And in the moment, in that situation, I acted impulsively. So I think I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation, Dawn, because I also think context and tone of voice can also be factors that can impact how we are how we are responding and reacting in a situation. Um, Oh, thank you. So this is good information. So Q, you said this is why it's fairly common in autistic communities to use tone indicators when communicating via text. Example, are you sure you saw that? Question mark, slash Jen, slash sarcastic. Jen is a genuine question. So yeah, right? Being able to give that little additional context within the text conversation. Christy, you said in my experience, this especially applies to folks like myself with autism who miss a lot of social cues and have to do a lot of guesswork. Yeah. I appreciate you guys bringing this into the conversation as well. Okay, cool. So let's keep diving deeper into this idea of CBT and kind of dive into the different types of thoughts. So in the context of cognitive behavioral therapy, we're really focusing on adaptive versus maladaptive thoughts. So adaptive thoughts are positive beliefs that are going to be based in reality that you might see as helpful or feel as helpful. And it's going to be more flexible in terms of how you're thinking, right? You're not just maybe looking at one side or the other. You're really focusing on both sides of the coin and really focusing on having more of a neutral way of thinking, right? So you might have a thought like, I'm good at my job, or my job, but I had an okay day today, right? Maybe it's not a great day, maybe it's not a fantastic day. It's like, oh yeah, I had a good day, or I had a great day at work. You might think to yourself that I can make a difference in the world, right? Even if it's small. You might have thoughts like, my family loves me, my family cares about me. I have good relationships overall with people, right? So really focusing on more positive beliefs. When someone is thinking in a more maladaptive way, though, the thoughts are a little bit more dysfunctional. They're a little bit more unrealistic, and they might be viewed as based in negativity. So that's when maybe you're hearing from somebody, I can't do this, I can't help people, I can't be successful, or never. So I will never be able to pursue my dreams. I will never be able to get that job. I will never be able to live on my own. Or even like the shoulds, I should have done this or I should have done that, right? Those can fall kind of more into this category of maladaptive thinking. And it's important to be able to identify the types of thoughts that you're having. Yes, absolutely, Dawn, right? Don't should all over yourself. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the different cognitive distortions a little bit down the line in our webinar today. But it is important to be able to identify the types of thoughts, because one thing to consider within this realm and context of CBT is thoughts are not always realistic, right? They're not always true. Just because we're thinking something does not mean that it's automatically true. Even in private practice, again, I try to approach this in my personal style is to try to be funny. Try being the key word. So something that I will, when I'm talking with a client and maybe we're doing some challenging of thinking and really trying to restructure some thoughts, something I'll bring up is, well, I love to think that I'm the Queen of England, but I am not the Queen of England. No matter how many times I wake up every day and say I am in fact the Queen of England, I am not the Queen of England, right? So being able to recognize that thoughts are just thoughts, and that even if we're having a maladaptive thought, we can change that to a more adaptive thought and really trying to empower people and really try to take some of that control back. When we're thinking about thoughts and beliefs within CBT, We're going to focus on automatic thoughts, intermediate beliefs, and then core beliefs. Okay. So when we're thinking about automatic thoughts, those are thoughts that are going to occur at more of like a surface level. When I think of automatic thoughts, intermediate beliefs, and then core beliefs, I really am visualizing in my head, at least, like an iceberg, right? So automatic thoughts are kind of like the tip of the iceberg, and then the intermediate beliefs are maybe like a little bit above the water, a little bit above, under the water, and then our core beliefs are really all the things underneath the water. So when we're thinking about automatic thoughts, those are thoughts that are influenced by how we are perceiving a situation. Okay. So you see that there's a new show coming out on your favorite station or your favorite streaming network, whatever you guys are watching. And you watch the show and you think to yourself, wow, that was a great show. And you feel excited and you're looking forward to watching it again. And then you go to work the next day and you're talking with coworkers. And you're actually shocked when you overhear a coworker saying that they watched the same show and they thought it made no sense, did not have a great plot, and are never planning to watch the show again. Right. So, in your feeling of it, you watched the show, your automatic thought was, this is great. And then your response and reaction is, I'm going to continue watching the show. For your coworker, though, they watched the show, they hated it, they did not like it. And now their response and reaction is that they're never going to watch it again. So each of you had different thoughts about the show. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong, right? It's how you individually perceived it, and you each felt differently about the show. And now you're going to respond differently. One of you is going to watch it, the other person is not going to watch it. When we're thinking about intermediate beliefs are really focusing on our attitudes, our values, and our assumptions about the world. Intermediate beliefs are also going to impact how we're perceiving a situation, how we're then behaving in that situation, and also how we might be feeling in the situation. Okay. So, for example, your attitude might be taking medication is not going to make a difference for me. So, your rule might be that I'm only going to try the medication for a few days. And the assumption might be that the medication is not going to work anyway, and I'll just stop taking it when I don't see a difference. So, this attitude is now influencing this rule and how you're behaving around the medication. And it's causing this assumption to occur, which is then just reinforcing everything, right? It's just reinforcing this idea that, like, well, the medication's not going to work. And I'm just going to stop taking it when I don't see a difference because I'm only going to take it a couple of days. And we know that sometimes it takes a little bit more than a couple of days for medication to work. And then core beliefs, again, are beliefs that develop, or I don't know why I'm saying again, I didn't explain this already. So core beliefs are beliefs that potentially develop in childhood, or are also developed because of a traumatic event or situation. And these beliefs are about ourselves, they're about other people, and they can also be about the world in general. The really tricky thing about core beliefs is that a lot of them are not necessarily conscious. We're not conscious of them as being a core belief. We're not all walking around like saying like, hey, my core belief about, this topic is this, or my core belief about this topic is that, right? It's just something that we believe because we almost see them as absolute truth. So an example that I can give you is, I have a client that I'm currently working with who has a core belief that they are not capable. And this core belief developed in childhood due to a situation with one of their parents. So it wasn't until we started meeting where this client actually was able to identify consciously, like, oh, yeah, I'm not capable. And after having a conversation about it, they started to recognize that this belief wasn't necessarily true, but was really, and also was really rooted in things that had kind of occurred earlier in their life. Okay. The thing to recognize about core beliefs is that when they're adaptive, right? So when there are these positive, more flexible thoughts about ourselves, they're going to be more effective. They're going to be more based in thoughts that the person has about themselves in terms of maybe being lovable, maybe being worthy. So when we're thinking about somebody being able to be effective, that's maybe someone saying, I am competent or capable at my job. Lovable, people enjoy my company. Worthy, I am a good person. But when someone experiences a negative event in their life, like a breakup, or maybe they get a bad review at work, their thoughts and perceptions of the situation might initially be negative. Like maybe they might have this thought of like, wow, I must not be a good employee. I didn't get a great review, or I wasn't able to complete that task in time. Or maybe they go through a breakup and they might think to themselves, I'm never going to find a good partner, right? I just have had all these breakups and it's not going to happen for me. But when we have these more adaptive core beliefs, after a period of time, the person starts to move on from some of those initial automatic thoughts maybe they had about the situation, and they kind of return back to these core beliefs that they have about themselves, that they are capable, that they are a good worker, that they are a lovable person. And there are going to be situations that the person's going to experience, like maybe getting good feedback at work. Maybe they see somebody new is interested in them. That's going to then reinforce these core beliefs that they have about themselves, that they are a good worker, that they are and can be a good partner and are a lovable person. That's going to help them to recognize and think back to and refocus on those adaptive core beliefs. When you're working with someone, though, that has more maladaptive core beliefs, you might be working with somebody who has maybe experienced like adverse childhood experiences, traumatic events as a child. As an adult now, maybe there's somebody really struggling with symptoms of depression. Maybe there's somebody who's experiencing and struggling with symptoms of anxiety. That person may not have developed adaptive beliefs about themselves as a child or as an adolescent. And because they did not develop many adaptive beliefs about themselves, their core beliefs are going to be more maladaptive. So when they received bad feedback at work, their belief that they're incompetent or that they're a failure is now going to be reinforced because they core belief that's already rooted in them not being in them being incapable or being worthless. Same thing for a person who is maybe experiencing a breakup, right? Their significant other breaks up with them. Their belief now is that no one's going to love them or that they're unattractive. And that is now going to be reinforced from the situation, supporting their beliefs, their more maladaptive beliefs. So before I move on, I just want to make sure that everything I'm kind of saying is making sense. Being clear. Is there anything about automatic thoughts or intermediate beliefs or core beliefs that maybe isn't making a lot of sense? Again, I know I'm throwing so much information at all of you. So I want to just give a second and let things kind of meld into your minds. All right, cool. So I wanted to just kind of reinforce a little bit more about automatic thoughts, right? So initially I had given the example about the television show, but I wanted to give an example that's probably a little bit more applicable to your work in supportive housing, right? So let's say you're working with somebody who has a appointment with you, and unfortunately they missed their appointment with you as their case manager. Let's say you're their case manager. So the thought that might occur to them is, my case manager is not going to want to help me. They're going to hate me. They're not going to work with me anymore. I always do this. This always happens. I can never be on time. I can never make appointments. They're going to be mad at me. And now the behavior is going to be that they're maybe ignoring your phone calls. Or maybe they're not answering the door because they think that you're going to be frustrated or mad at them. Do you think that do you think this is something that might be applicable to some of the individuals that you're working with? Do you think a situation like this has ever happened with any of the individuals that you're working with? Diana, that was like a yes, a yes. That was like an intense yes. I love it. I love to see it. Yeah, frequently, all the time. And I use this specific example, right? Because I think once you are able to meet with that person again, right? This could be a situation to use when you're trying to teach some of the techniques we're going to talk about in a little bit. So again, just a very normal, typical situation, right? This would happen to me all the time when I was working in supportive housing here in New Jersey. I'd show up to somebody's door, they're not home, they're late, they missed the appointment, and then they don't want to see me again. I kind of feel like they're ghosting me a little bit. So then another staff will go out and meet with them, and then that'll kind of clear the air and kind of settle things down a little bit. But then we can go back in, right? And we can try to teach some techniques to help the person work through these types of thoughts. And yeah, Maddie, and I appreciate the suggestion, right? Yes, but at intake, you do let your clients know that if something comes up, just to give a call for a heads up and we can reschedule. And I would say, like, for me personally, and I would love to hear from other folks as well. I would say like 50% of the time that would work. I still just had clients that leaned more towards more maladaptive thinking. And were very, very sure and convinced that I was never going to meet with them ever again because they missed an appointment, which was not true. So it's hard. And yeah, that's also a really good point as well, Kim, right? Depending on what else is happening with the person, if they're experiencing symptoms or if a crisis occurs and they're feeling dysregulated, it might be difficult for them in that moment to be able to call and kind of give that heads up. And then, Dawn, you also bring up a good point. This can be especially challenging when individuals have social skills deficits, such as telling people no. No, it's not a good time for an appointment, may be harder than just not being there. Yeah, right. And that's also a really good point to bring into this conversation, right? Because if you say, hey, let's meet again at 2:00, and they know that they have something else to do at 2:00 and they're uncertain about saying no because of maybe social skills deficits, or maybe they have this thought of, well, if I tell somebody no, they're going to hate me. Or if I tell somebody no, they're not going to want to help me anymore. It's easier for them to just maybe not show up than to have to say no and have that thought be reinforced by then me saying to them, no, I'm never going to meet with you ever again, even though that wouldn't happen. So all great points you guys are bringing into the conversation. Thank you. So again, to reinforce these intermediate beliefs, so maybe you're working with somebody who has an attitude that people can't be trusted. So now their rule is, I'm going to keep people at a distance. And this assumption is then going to be, people don't want to help me, they're just going to hurt me, and I'm not going to ask for help. And I think this is very similar to the example Dawn just brought up, right? So this attitude of people can't be trusted, or, people don't want to help me, people are just going to hurt me, people are just going to hurt my feelings, that's going to have influence them in now establishing this rule where they're like, no, I'm just going to stay away from people. I'm not going to get too close. I'm not going to get too involved with that person. And it's going to reinforce this assumption that people don't want to help me. They're just going to hurt me. And I'm just not going to ask anybody for help. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that for somebody like this, they've probably had many experiences in their lives that have reinforced this and have contributed to this attitude, this rule, and this assumption that the person's experiencing. Does this sound like any of the individuals you're working with? Because this sounds like a lot of the individuals that I was working with when I was still working in supported housing. Yeah. Absolutely. Dawn said most. And Dana said absolutely yes. Yeah. And I hope that in kind of hearing about automatic thoughts in this context, hearing about intermediate beliefs, and as we get into our final example for core beliefs in this context, I'm hoping that this is going to help you all in maybe better understanding some of the individuals that you're working with, and better understanding a little bit where they're coming from and why maybe they're reacting and responding in the way that they are. And then finally, just core beliefs. And these are just some what I'll refer to as like quote unquote common, maybe not so common core beliefs that people might have about themselves. People don't care about me. I don't deserve help. I make bad choices. I'm worthless. I'm evil. I'm a failure. Something is wrong with me. And then really thinking about how some of these core beliefs are now going to influence how people are reacting and responding in situations, right? So if somebody has this belief about themselves that people don't care about me, it's going to be hard for them to trust you. It's going to be hard for them to trust other people. It's going to be hard for them to accept help. If they have this belief that they're worthless or that they make bad choices, maybe they're engaging in more risky behaviors, right? Because they're not worth anything and they know this about themselves that they do make bad choices. So maybe now they're going to just keep engaging in some of these risky behaviors, like using, if they have this core belief that they're a failure, it's probably going to impact their desire or their motivation to want to find a job, right? Or want to become employed. If they have this belief that something is wrong with me, it might impact their ability or their, again, motivation, desire to even seek help, right? Seek support, go to the psychiatrist, go to the doctor, go to program, meet with you all, right? And get that additional support because they just have this belief that something is wrong with them and nothing's going to help them. So that is my overview of kind of CBT, the cognitive model, the cognitive triangle, the different thoughts and beliefs within the context of CBT. So automatic thoughts, intermediate beliefs, and core beliefs. I'm going to move in and kind of transition into some of our techniques now. But before I do, does anybody have any questions about anything that I previously talked about? And I hope that for those of you who have knowledge of CBT, that this was a good refresher. And for those of you who maybe weren't familiar with CBT, that this is going to be helpful information. Because I do very much believe that before being in a place where you're going to be teaching CBT and kind of techniques to individuals, I think it is helpful to have just this basic understanding of what it is. Yeah. All right, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So these are the different techniques that we're going to go over. So I have techniques that are going to support changing thoughts, and then a few techniques that can support changing behaviors. So in thinking about techniques that can support changing thoughts, something that I always love to share with individuals are cognitive distortions. So who here, is anybody here familiar with cognitive distortions and what they are? Has anybody ever heard that terminology before? And I just put a link to cognitive distortions in the chat. This is the website I like to share with people because I think they have a pretty comprehensive list of cognitive distortions. So cognitive distortions basically refer to how we perceive or are categorizing the different thoughts that we have. Something that I always like to emphasize when I'm explaining these types of thoughts to individuals is that we all experience cognitive distortions. And if this is new information to you, you might see some of these and think to yourself, oh my gosh, I say this all the time. And that's where I really do like to reinforce these types of cognitive that everybody experiences this type of thinking. One of the reasons why I really like to share this with people is there are a lot of people that experience some of these cognitive distortions and don't realize or recognize that this is a maladaptive way of thinking, essentially, right? This is thinking that isn't helpful and oftentimes contributes negatively to the person and kind of how they're feeling, and again, how they're reacting and responding in situations. So the example that I personally identify the most with, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but is should. I'm a should girl. There have been times in my life where I have lived my life thoroughly and very, very much through this idea of what I should have done or what I should be doing. I'm also guilty of overgeneralizing at times. And using a lot of always and never talk. So this always happens to me, or this never happens to me. But for me, I might experience a situation and my thought might be a should statement. It's going to impact me negatively for a short period of time. I'm not going to feel that great if like, oh, you know, I should have prepared better, right? I should have prepared for this webinar better. Or I should have turned in my evaluation sooner, right? I should have done these things. But it's not something that's going to largely contribute to me experiencing any symptoms of anxiety or depression. For some of the individuals that you're working with, though, that might be the opposite. They might experience a situation where they're having an automatic thought that this always happens to me or nothing good ever happens to me. And this is then going to impact how they're feeling about themselves and how they might act in the future. So in educating consumers about these types of thoughts, I like to look at it as I'm helping to, or really hoping to, empower someone to take their power back and really try to recognize the thought and its impact, and also maybe change that thought. The other technique I'm going to share with you, and I will put this in the chat towards the end, is catch it, or actually, I think I have catch it, check it, change it on here. But we're going to talk a little bit about catch it, check it, change it. And I like to pair educating people on cognitive distortions with catch it, check it, change it, because once somebody recognizes some of the thoughts that they're having that are impacting how they're kind of perceiving the world, catch it, check it, change it can help them to recognize the thoughts and then change those thoughts to something more neutral or more realistic. So Katie, you talked about lots of self-sabotaging comes from these behaviors. Nobody likes me, so I'm going to behave in a way that nobody will like me, which just proves that nobody likes me, right? Absolutely, that's that reinforcement. So just to kind of talk a little bit about some of these, just to kind of give a general overview. And again, I really recommend going to Psych Central because I love the explanation that they have on all of these. So polarized thinking is something that a lot of people experience. So that's when you're using a lot of all or nothing thinking, a lot of black and white thinking without any shades of gray. Overgeneralizing, again, I said a little bit earlier, overgeneralizing is something that I personally experienced in the past. That's when you're using words like always, never, everything, nothing. I know the first time I read Cognitive Distortions and I read through them and I saw those kind of keywords of always, never, everything, for the next week, I sat there and I would think something and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm doing it again. And oh my gosh, I'm doing it again, because I was hearing myself think those words. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm thinking a lot of these thoughts, and I'm doing overgeneralization. Another one is catastrophizing. So that is very much related to jumping to conclusions. So you're jumping to the worst possible conclusion in every scenario, no matter how improbable it is. Another one is blaming. So that's when you might have someone who you're working with who is saying that you made me feel this way. Should statements was something that Dawn talked about. And then always being right. So this desire of always being right turns into a cognitive distortion when it's then trumping everything else, including evidence and other people's feelings. Okay. So a lot of great information on cognitive distortions, great information, in my opinion, to share with some of the individuals that you're working with. And there's tons of information out there on cognitive distortions. So again, that website is just like my personal favorite website, but you can definitely use a different website if you prefer. So any questions on cognitive distortions before I move on to some of the other techniques? All right. So thinking back to what we learned earlier about CBT, we know that our emotions could potentially be influencing how we're perceiving a situation. So this technique of how can I manage my predictions, I think is really good for somebody who you might be meeting with who is really feeling sad, maybe experiencing some symptoms of anxiety. And it seems like those emotions are impacting how they're viewing life or they're viewing the situation. So this could be a really good time to use that skill. I also do want to highlight really quick, because I don't think I did earlier, is this Tompkins and Beck book. I'm going to highlight it at the end of the webinar, but this is where I chose some of the techniques from. This book was authored by Tompkins, but is also co-authored by Dr. Judith Beck from the Beck Institute, which is one of the reasons why I really like this. What I thought was cool about this book is there's a book for adults, and then there's also a book that this author wrote actually for adolescents that has similar techniques, but more focused for children and adolescents, which I thought was really cool. So I thought this was a good resource. But in general, this book is a great resource. So any book, any technique in this book, I would definitely recommend. So the author of this book specifically recommends that the person use this skill for 2 weeks, just to kind of get an idea of the types of predictions that they're making. But I also think that this is something that you could teach and work on with somebody and then come back to at the next session in a week. The point is really to keep coming back to it, right? Because we want to be able to test whether or not the person's prediction ended up coming true. And this is going to help the person to see that their emotion and their state of mind at the time that they filled the worksheet out was influencing how they were thinking and viewing the situation. Thank you, Dawn. So it's the Anxiety and Depression Workbook by Thompson and Beck. The reference is going to be at the end of the webinar, and I also have a picture of it in the webinar just to really highlight it. So for how to manage my predictions, he has a worksheet in the book, but essentially what you're looking at is asking the person to describe what the negative thing is that they think will happen and when will it happen, how strong they would rate this belief. I think he uses a scale of like 1 to 10 in the book, but I think this is, in terms of like scaling, I think there's a lot of really creative ways we can use scaling, right? So we can do it 1 to 10, you can do a 1 to 5. You could do smiley faces and sad faces, emojis. There's, I think, tons of ways to kind of rate the belief in terms of its intensity. And then again, we're coming back, right? So the first two columns are that initial of what do they think is going to happen and when it's going to happen and how strong they're rating the belief. And then we're coming back to it where we're having the person briefly describe what actually happened. And then really putting down on paper, was the prediction you made about what would happen true or false? And I also think this is a really good place to have a conversation, right? So this is, I think, for a lot of people, writing these things down can be helpful. And I think when you're trying to make a comparison, you do want to write some things down. But I think this could be a really good talking point and a good place to really expand in terms of, was the prediction true or false, and really help the person to kind of walk through their thoughts and their feelings about the situation, and how they reacted and responded in the situation to really flesh out those connections between their thoughts and their emotions and their behaviors. Any questions about this technique before I move on? And I guess my question to all of you out there is, do you think this is something that you might be able to use with any of the individuals that you might currently be working with? Like, does this technique stand out in the sense of, oh man, I wish I could have used this with this person, last week or what have you? All right, awesome. And again, what I really like about this one is that it is a good way to really recognize whether or not this might be something to use with somebody, is really honing in on those emotions, right? Where maybe the person's emotions are really impacting how they're thinking and viewing the situation. So the next one is, what is the view from the balcony? Um, And I think this technique would be really good for working with somebody who um, maybe jumps to some of those negative conclusions about a situation, and then really focuses in on and hones in on that as what the actual outcome will be. So the person is maybe making some assumptions. Their view is clouded by and really focused on the details and specifics of the situation. And again, like really honing in on it and maybe not really able to see some of the larger context of what's actually, occurring in the situation. The other thing about this technique, which I really like about it, is using this technique is going to help the person to think about the situation as if they are looking into it or viewing it from the balcony. And if you have somebody who you're working with that is much more of like a visual person, I think this technique could be something that could really resonate with the person. Because when you think about being on an actual balcony, right, when you're higher up, you see more and you can see the bigger picture, right? So when you're at a hotel, when you are at on the ground floor and you're looking out on the property, like maybe you're on a resort or something like that, you are kind of seeing things, a very small picture of what is actually being offered to you at the resort, right? So has anybody here ever been to Disney World or Disneyland? Disneyland is probably, or an amusement park of any kind. You can just give me a yes or no in the chat. All right, both. Cool. So I'll speak specifically to Disney World, but I think this could also be like if you're up on a roller coaster, right? When you're actually in a theme park of some sort and you're on the ground, you can really only kind of see what's in front of you, or maybe you have the map. Back when I was younger, we had to use maps walking around these theme parks. Now I know Disney has an app. But when you go on Disney and you go on like the monorail in the Magic Kingdom, I think that's what it's called. I haven't been there in a couple years. That's when you really get a view of the park, right? Or when you're going on, or maybe the monorail isn't what you go. I think the People Mover is what you are on in the park. The monorail is what you can take from park to park. But when you're actually on the monorail, I'll say, that's when you really get to see how big Disney is, right? When you're seeing all the different parks and you're seeing all the different hotels, that gives you the bigger picture. So when the person is on, and if we take this back to like an actual theater, or if we take it back to the theme park, right? When the person's on the ground, you're really just seeing other people in front of you, or maybe you're seeing a specific restaurant or a specific snack stand. But when you actually get on and have like more of an aerial view, that's when you really start to see the bigger picture. So that's one of the reasons why I really like this technique. It really helps the person to consider some of those alternate viewpoints of the situation and really kind of get out of their own head in a way, and really see what is happening more globally. So for this, again, it could be very conversational. If the person wants to write things down or you want to write things down, you definitely can. But what you're doing is you're asking the consumer to describe the situation, what their negative view of the situation would look like, and again, rate how strong this belief is, and then talk about the different viewpoints or perspectives of the situation, and then have them rate how true or likely the alternate viewpoints or perspectives might be. Okay, so we're focusing on their negative point and having them rate that, and then we're talking about some of these alternate viewpoints or perspectives and having them rate that. Once you've talked about those alternative ones, then you're having the person go back to their negative view of the situation and have them re-rate it. And the hope is, once you've had this conversation about the different viewpoints or perspectives and have them rate how strong or how true or likely those alternate viewpoints are, that once the person goes back to rate their initial belief, that the rating will be a little bit lower. So the next technique is, how have I coped in the past? And I like this again because I also think that this technique could also be very, very conversational. So this could be something to use like if you're in the car and driving with somebody, or maybe since it's now going to be nicer weather, hopefully. I know somebody said it was chilly where they were earlier. And we've had pretty nice weather here on the East Coast. But even if you're outside and taking a walk, this is also something that I think a good conversation you can have with the person. But this is going to be good to use when you're working with someone who is maybe focusing on a situation or worried about the situation where they're unsure if they can get through it. So they're going through something and they're really just like, I don't know. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm going to get through it. The caveat with this technique, though, is that because you're going to be focusing on how they have coped with a situation in the past, it implies that they've been through the situation before. And that can either be like a good or a bad thing. And I say that because I know in the past when I worked with people, again, there's could potentially be this reinforcement of this always happens to me, which is, as we know, not a line of thinking we want to, help the person kind of continue with, right? So it's just something to be mindful of. When you are using this technique with somebody, there might be like a lot of redirection that you have to do to help keep the person focused. So just kind of being mindful of some of those things. I think that this technique can definitely work for, again, maybe someone who's feeling worried about going to the doctor and is thinking that maybe they're going to get bad news. Maybe this could be like a recurring situation. A lot of the individuals we work with, they have a lot of physical health conditions. And if their physical health condition isn't getting better, I can 100% see that contributing to them having a lot of negative thoughts about going to the doctor. Right now, what is the doctor going to tell me? They're just going to tell me I'm more sick. They're going to tell me my diabetes isn't any better. They're going to tell me my blood pressure is still high. Right. So for this one, this technique is something that, again, can just in general be applied to something that has happened in the past where maybe they've had similar thoughts. I think it's something that could be very applicable to a lot of different situations. To just give an example, let's say the person is maybe thinking about going to a community event alone. You might ask them to identify some of their feelings. And let's say they're feeling scared. You might then ask them to identify what some of their thoughts are. Maybe their thought is that no one's going to like them. You can then ask them to think about a situation where maybe they felt scared in the past, or a situation where they thought no one might like them, and then ask them to describe the ways that they coped with the past situation. So this technique can also be used when maybe the person hasn't done something before, but you can relate it back to that emotion that they've experienced. Yeah, Katie, that's like, they're going to tell me to stop eating sugar and start exercising, right? And it's hard, right? It can be, it's so challenging, right? Because so many of the individuals that we're working with, I want to say that I recognize that even though I think a lot of these techniques could be very helpful, I understand why this person that we're talking about, Katie, feels that way, right? I would feel really crappy about having to go back to the doctor when they're telling me to stop eating sugar and just start exercising as well, right? And being mindful also of kind of where the person's at and how they're feeling, right? Because to reiterate, these techniques, right, they're really for those individuals. Some of these experiences are really going to impact them and could potentially contribute to increasing some of their symptoms. It might not be necessary to use that technique for every client. So I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation, Katie, because I get that, right? I would feel frustrated and annoyed about going to the doctor also, if that's kind of the messaging I was getting from my doctor. So this technique I like because it is pretty versatile. It's kind of like a quicker exercise because you're really just focusing on these two things, right? You're asking the consumer to describe a difficult situation they experienced in the past. Again, if they have never gone through that specific situation, you can just ask them about what they're feeling and try to think of a past situation where they had that feeling. And then talking about the different ways they coped with the situation or the feeling in the past. And the one thing I really like about this technique that I'll say is this is something that I think can feel really empowering for people. I think when you have somebody who you're working with that is going through a situation where they're feeling very uncertain and feeling like they don't know if they're going to be able to get through something, you are feeling very powerless in that situation, right? So I think this technique can be very helpful in trying to give that person maybe some of their power back and focus on the things that they can control. So the next technique is, how can I jump back from the worst? And this technique is a little bit more in depth. But let's say that you're working with someone and the person you're working with has a really time imagining a good outcome might occur from a situation, or that they will be able to get through and overcome the situation. So this is an exercise for someone who is not in a space where they can even conceptualize or comprehend that they're going to be able to get through it. Like, it's just not going to happen. Or the situation's just not going to change. And I want to highlight, before I get into this, I want to highlight what Christy's saying in the chat, that you said I get good results by wording this so that the emphasis is on the success of the past coping. Like, tell me about a time you coped well with a bad situation and how you did. And I like that framing of that, right? Because you're focusing more on what the person achieved and accomplished. And I think that's a really good way to frame it going into this conversation to get over that caveat. So thank you, Christy. Getting back to how I jumped back from the worst. So this is somebody who was really just convinced, for whatever reason, that the worst thing is going to happen. Whatever that worst thing is, it is 100% going to happen. Maybe using some of the other techniques we talked about, it's not working. What is good about this technique is you're essentially coming up with a plan that the person can go back to help them, if this were to happen, right? Help them to then cope with that situation if the worst thing happens. And I like that because I know for a lot of the individuals I worked with in the past who have experienced symptoms of anxiety, some of their feelings of anxiety or symptoms related to anxiety are really, again, rooted in the lack of control or the lack of predictability around the situation. They don't know what to expect. They don't know what's going to happen. So having a plan is something that can help the person to feel less anxious, but at the same time also empowered and more in control, so that if the situation does actually happen, they have a route that they can take to help them to handle the situation. So in this technique, we're asking the consumer to describe what their worst case prediction looks like. And we're also asking them to rate how much they believe they might be able to cope with the situation. Then we're having the person describe their strengths and resources that they have or might be able to attain to cope with the situation. We're going to ask them to, thank you, Katie. We're going to ask them to describe what they can do for themselves to help cope with the situation. So do as an action, right? So what action steps they can take to actually cope with the situation. And then what can they say to themselves to help them cope with the situation, right? So what positive self-talk or affirmations can they use to help? Even like a mantra they can kind of come up with to help them cope with the situation. And then we're asking them to identify who their supports are that they can speak to, that can give them some support with coping with the situation, and then any other ways that they can cope with the situation. And then once they've kind of developed this plan, and this is something you might want to think about writing down, once they've kind of come up with the plan, then you want to ask them to re-rate themselves on their ability to cope with the situation. And again, the idea is at the onset, right, the person is maybe going to rate themselves as feeling a little bit lower in terms of their ability or capability around coping with the situation. But once we've reinforced some of those strengths, the resources, the things they can do, the things they can say, the people that they can rely on, hopefully then once they're re-rating themselves, it'll be a little bit of a higher rating. That's awesome, Christy. You said at the mental hospital, you made wallet-sized cards in group with the clients with coping skills they had selected, so they had it in case of emergency. Yeah, that very much sounds like wellness and recovery action planning a little bit. And I think this also very much reminds me of like a crisis plan a little bit. I think it has some of the same concepts, which I like, right? Because again, we know that plans, they can be very helpful. And depending on what the situation is, worst case scenario, the person is probably going to feel like in a place where they might not be able to think. They might not really be able to put a lot of thought or energy, emotional energy into kind of figuring out how to navigate things. So I love having wallet-sized coping skills, just a written down plan of action, those types of things that are really handy and accessible for people. I love hearing about that stuff. Thank you, Christy, for sharing that. So now we're getting into some of the techniques to change behavior. Before I move into changing behavior, I do just want to ask if anybody had any questions about the thoughts, about the techniques for thoughts that I talked about. All right. If you do, put it in the chat. So this is taken directly from the Beck Institute website. The Beck Institute has a lot of resources for practitioners and providers, and I just put it in the chat. This is also a clickable link in the PDF of the PowerPoint when you get it. But this is called activity scheduling. And activity scheduling is something that can work really well for people that you're working with that are potentially experiencing symptoms of depression. So this is somebody who you're working with that are maybe talking about feeling tired, they have very low energy, maybe they're expressing like a lack of motivation to do things. When you're in that headspace, right, you're gonna probably be reluctant to do some of the things that are going to give you joy or give you some of your energy back. Or maybe the person's even unconsciously or consciously avoiding some of those things because maybe they just don't want to feel good, right? In thinking back to CBT as a concept, though, when someone is avoiding self-care, their self-care routine, or maybe avoiding things like cleaning their home or doing laundry, or even doing something fun that they enjoy, chances are they're probably experiencing some of these negative thoughts along with that, right? So maybe it's something like I'm lazy, or maybe they're thinking that whatever task they need to complete is too much for them and they're left feeling overwhelmed. This is going to then contribute to them experiencing that depressed mood, right? It's reinforcing that. So the idea or the thought is that if we can replace that inaction, so that person not doing the things that maybe they want to be doing that would help them feel better, or some of the things they need to do for their home or household, with a different activity, then participating in that activity might elicit a more positive thought, which is then going to help them feel better and maybe feel more hopeful about what's going on in their life. So to encourage someone to participate in that activity, you might have them use an activity schedule to plan out their day. And it could be something like this. Again, directly from a worksheet packet that the Beck Institute has developed. And this schedule can also be as detailed as the consumer wants it to be, or it can also be modified. So maybe we're only looking at 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. because that's all they can manage to fill out for the day, right? The person doesn't have to fill out every single hour of every day. Maybe when you teach them how to fill this out, you're only focusing on doing this 1 to 2 days a week. Maybe you're focusing on just, until like 8 or 9 because they're going to bed at that time. Maybe there's somebody who wakes up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and doesn't go to bed until 3 o'clock in the morning. So that could also alter how you're structuring this. It should be specific to the person and kind of their schedule and their routine. In terms of what activities the person wants to fill out, it's a good conversation to have with the person on what they want to put on. Maybe you're focusing the conversation on how they used to spend their day when they were feeling well, what activities or hobbies they have that they used to participate in but don't anymore. Maybe someone is scheduling to go to an AA meeting, maybe they're scheduling to go to a class at a library, or maybe they're just scheduling when they're showering or brushing their teeth, right? Whatever the person wants to put on this, they can put on this. And the other good thing about putting it on a chart is you're making that commitment. You're making that commitment for that person to do that activity, excuse me, for just that one part of the day or that whole day. From there, right, the person could then be building up that momentum right? They're going to feel maybe more success. Maybe they're going to feel like they want to schedule more things. The other good thing about this is I know for me personally, if I don't write it down, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not. That's just not how my brain functions, right? I need to literally write everything down. So if you're working with somebody who maybe is forgetful in that manner, or maybe they're not feeling well, right? So if they're not feeling well, that could also contribute to them maybe feeling forgetful. Having this written down in this manner is going to help reinforce and help them to remember that they planned on doing this, and that it's not out of sight and out of mind for the person. And then Christy, you said even just building a schedule around waking activities first thing in the morning and then bedtime hygiene at night could be a good way to introduce someone to structuring their day. Yeah, because again, you could literally have let's say 7 to 10, like these 3 chunks of time, and you could just black out everything else until 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. That's literally if that's what the person wants, right? It doesn't have to feel overwhelming. You can even just do morning and just start out with morning for the person for a couple of days and then build on top of that, right? You really want to tailor it to the person and kind of where they're at. And I want to get through these last 2 because we're just about at the end. So the other thing, the final technique that you can do is using the staircase to achieve goals. So something that can support somebody in activity scheduling is something called graded task assignments, or what Dr. Beck actually refers to as the staircase analogy. So for some of the individuals that we're working with, certain goals the person might have, or even tasks that might feel overwhelming to the person, what you can do is you can use this staircase to break the task or the goal down into steps. That can help the person to then identify what is needed in order to work toward completing that task or goal. This is something that can be used in developing service plans or your treatment plans, whatever your agency refers to them. It could also be a precursor or something to use in conjunction with the knowledge, skills, and resources process that our department talks about in the Golden Thread training that we facilitate. You can also just use this when skills teaching with somebody when you're developing the different steps of the skill, right? So this is something that's very versatile. And it doesn't always have to be in order, right? So for this, I used employment as the example. So some of the steps that the person needs to take is develop a resume, get closed for an interview, learn how to answer interview questions, go to the library to use the computer, create a profile with Indeed, renew their state ID, contact their old boss for references, right? It could be in any order. It doesn't necessarily have to be consecutive, but it's, again, a good visual representation for somebody. If breaking down, if a task is feeling very large, being able to break it down so it seems a little bit more and feels a little bit more achievable. Okay. And then, yeah, I want to highlight what John said in terms of the morning work could end up being a behavioral activator for more activities, right? It's all about that momentum. It's all about helping the person to kind of build that momentum, because when they're feeling good, chances are they're going to be having more adaptive thoughts. And the last thing I just wanted to highlight is mindfulness. And my colleague Crystal did a webinar earlier in the year on mindfulness that I think is on the Washington HCA YouTube channel. But just some skills that you can Google around mindfulness are the wise mind, the what skills, and the how skills. And yes, Olivia, you will 100% have access to this PowerPoint. It's going to be sent out. So in terms of the resources, I wanted to just highlight really quickly the 2 main books that I used in developing this PowerPoint. First is the Anxiety and Depression Workbook from Michael Tompkins with a foreword by Judith Beck. This is a self-help book, which is one of the things I really like about it, because it's for the person. Which I think is great for us as supportive housing workers to be able to use, because we can teach this. These are skills that that person could teach themselves. So it's skills that we can help to teach them, right? And then I used the third edition of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy by Judith Beck to help kind of with the theoretical information. I did put an evaluation in the chat. Please feel free to fill out the evaluation. Any feedback that you guys want to give me, give us, is always very helpful and very welcome. We very much appreciate it. So that's in the chat if you want to fill that out. And then thank you. So we definitely appreciate your time and your attention, your engagement and participation today. Just to reiterate, today's webinar was hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. I do just want to remind you that the slide, as well as a link to the recording of this, is going to be provided to you on email, through email, as well as a wealth of other resources. And then don't forget to check out the Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all things FCS, as well as all upcoming training events. Thank you guys so much. That's all I have for today. We hope you have and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. I'm going to stop recording.